Hey friends, welcome back to another episode of The Bible Unmuted. My name is Matthew Halstead. Thank you for tuning in. This podcast is all about carefully engaging scripture as an ancient text that offers timeless truth. And so I hope you find today's episode to be thought-provoking and encouraging. Today we dive into Revelation chapter 20, and we'll be looking specifically at verses 1 through 3. Now, this chapter, Revelation 20, is the focus of intense debate about the so-called millennial question, the 1,000-year reign of Christ. And as I'm sure you already know, there are three main views about the millennium. There is the premillennial view, there is the amillennial view, and then there's the postmillennial view. And it's interesting to me how all of Revelation seems to unfortunately get tied into that question. You know, whenever you are studying Revelation, somebody might have asked you, okay, so what's your view on the millennium? I say it's interesting because that particular passage that deals with the millennium is just a small part in Revelation, at least explicitly. Now, what I want to do in this episode is introduce some of the background stuff that will help us to think carefully about that question. And then next week, we're going to dive further into the chapter. In fact, I think we'll just go ahead and finish up the chapter in the next episode. But today, we're just going to launch in and do some intro stuff. All right, so I mentioned the three views. There's the premillennial view and the amillennial view and the postmillennial view. The premillennial view says that Christ will return before or pre the millennium. That's why it's called premillennial. So Christ shows up, and then after he shows up, he sets up a 1,000-year reign upon the earth. Okay, so the amillennial view is slightly different. This is the view that says that Christ's millennial reign has already begun. It is that time frame, that era between his first and second comings. It is the church age. And so Jesus comes back at the end of the millennium, and that's when judgment happens and the new creation and so forth and so on. It's called amillennial because anytime you put an A in front of a word, you negate the word. And so sometimes all millennialists are accused of not believing in a millennium. And that's not true. All millennialists do believe in the millennium. It's just a different conception of the millennium. It is symbolic. It's longer than a literal 1,000-year reign or a literal 1,000 years. The post-millennial view is interesting, and prior to World War I, it was the predominant view here in the United States. It's the view that says that the church, as the gospel goes out, as evangelism is being conducted throughout the world, the idea is that the church will usher in the millennium. The world will be primed, as it were, for the king to return. And so the idea of a post-millennial conception is that Christ comes essentially at the tail end or after the millennium. It's an interesting view, and as I said, it was a popular view back in the day. Now, if you want some good historical overview about these three positions, I highly recommend checking out David De Silva's book, Discovering Revelation. I mean, it's a great book on a number of levels, but specifically with respect to this question, he'll go into some of the historical components of how the church has thought about this sort of thing and why there were various shifts in thinking. So, for example, early on, the premillennial position was, it seems, a predominant position. Okay, and part of that, likely, says De Silva, has to do with the fact that the church was persecuted early on. And so if you don't feel at home in the world, then you're looking for a home elsewhere, right? And so this was the idea that the kingdom would be coming. And so because the world was ran by tyrants back in those days, and you know, one wonders if that has changed much. But anyway, that's another topic. But these early Christians, they were looking forward to something. They're looking forward to rescue, and they had every motivation to look forward to rescue. All right. Now, all of this changed, says De Silva, whenever Constantine becomes emperor, and he not only allows, but he welcomes Christianity as the official religion. And at this point, Christians began to feel home in this world, that they begin to think, my goodness, the kingdom has come, it seems. And so under that understanding, The amillennial position begins to take hold and take foot. That, my goodness, maybe we are ruling and reigning with Christ right now during this symbolic millennium. Now, of course, one well-known proponent of this sort of thinking was St. Augustine in his book, The City of God, book 20. Around the chapter 7, 8, 9 section is where you can find some of his musings on the subject. In fact, later on in this episode, I'll refer back to him as well. At any rate, if you're interested in some of those historical shifts and the dynamics of belief about the millennium, through the history of the church, I would recommend David De Silva's book, Discovering Revelation. I've mentioned it a few times here on the podcast, but I want to go ahead and plug it here because it is very helpful. Now, before we jump into this whole discussion, I think it's good to just take a step back, take a breath, and exercise some humility, because I do know that this is a question that receives a lot of debate. As I said earlier, it's the subject of a lot of debate. I guess that's a better way to put it. I found it really helpful when I was reading through Craig Keener's commentary. Craig was on the podcast with his wife Maydeen not too long ago, which, by the way, you should go check that interview out. It was a lot of fun. But at any rate, in Craig's commentary on Revelation, he has a few thoughts on the way we should approach this question, and I just absolutely love the way he put it. And so what I want to do is read 3 short quotes from his book. This comes from page 473 of his Revelation commentary. Here's what he says. He says, quote, "The 2 millennial views most widely held in different sections of Christendom today are premillennialism and amillennialism. Each has more arguments in its favor than advocates of the opposing position generally recognize." I'm sorry, let me repeat that last line. He says, each has more arguments in its favor than advocates of the opposing position generally recognize. I love this understanding of how to think through this text, because it's recognizing that there are, it seems, 2 primary positions, amillennialism and premillennialism. Those are the 2 predominant ones. Postmillennialism has sort of fallen out of favor, as many commentators will say, because it's a fairly optimistic view about things. And whenever World War I hit, it was a very gruesome war. Then World War II after that, and the 20th century was very bloody on a number of other levels. The post-millennial optimism and outlook began to wane. And so that was in large part due to cultural factors. And that's not to say, of course, you can't find post-millennialists out there, but they are out there, and they have a lot of things to say. But the 2 primary ones are the pre and the all, right? The pre-millennial and the amillennial. But I really like how he describes this within these 2 camps. That both camps, they don't necessarily have a slam dunk in their favor. That there are generally really good reasons for the opposing side, says Keener. And I think that's a really good approach to this question. He goes on page 476. He adds some other thoughts. This is a paragraph. I'm going to go ahead and read the whole paragraph, actually, because it captures kind of the way in which people think about this topic and their respective methodologies, if you will. So here's what he says on page 476. He says, strong arguments are available for both millennial positions and tend to rise or fall on how one reads the rest of the Bible. In general, if one starts with Revelation 20, one will be premillennial. Starting from that premise, those so inclined can also apply many promises about national Israel to that period in a literal manner, although Revelation 20 itself does not demand that we attribute those promises to that period. If one starts with most New Testament passages about the end time, one will probably be amillennial and then need to determine what to do with Revelation 20. Each view makes sense on its own presuppositions, but often sounds like special pleading to one who starts with different presuppositions. So, yeah, I'll just stop there. I think that's a really good way to put it. It depends on where you start the race in figuring this whole debate out. It depends where you start. It depends on your starting point. Are you starting with Revelation 20? Well, according to Keener, then you probably will end up premillennial. That becomes the driving motif through which you read everything else in Scripture. But if you start with these other scriptural passages, then that might influence the way you read Revelation 20. In other words, you're going to take Revelation 20 and sort of fit it into the mosaic that you're that you're creating with these other passages. I found that to be true myself. I think that's a really good observation. And so I just pass it along to you. One last quote from Craig Keener. This comes from page 478. I love this quote. It's so good. He says this: "The Bible is a big book, and few of us have mastered it well enough to think we are beyond learning more." Let me repeat that because it is worth repeating. The Bible is a big book, and few of us have mastered it well enough to think we are beyond learning more. Wonderful words from Craig Keener on a topic that, again, is the center of much debate and sometimes much fury. Well, maybe not a lot of fury these days, thankfully, but it does create very tense conversations sometimes. It is important to know that we can learn from each other. So that is a beautiful way to preface this whole discussion, because whatever your view ends up being, if it's slightly different than mine, that's okay. If it's a lot different than mine, that's quite okay. I have a lot to learn from you. And I would hope to think that I have a lot to offer as well. Maybe, my view, even if it's not yours, could help you see things in a better light when it comes to other texts. I don't know. This is how dialogue works. Everybody has their own position and everybody's in their own corner, and we bring something to the middle, and it's helpful, especially when it's shared in Christian love. So I offer these musings to you in a spirit of Christian charity. Now, I have to also say that I'm not just going to come out and tell you what to believe, or I'm gonna often speak in rather ambiguous ways. That is because I happen to agree with Craig Keener. There are lots of good arguments on both sides, so I don't land anywhere very firmly. I think that there are really good arguments on both sides of the debate, on all these different sides. I mean, postmillennialism, I love the optimism of it even. And so there are some things that I think are helpful with that view as well. So I think what I'm primarily interested in doing in these discussions, though, is not so much finding the right answers, but finding the right questions to ask. And so this is where I want to begin. What sort of questions do we need to ask? In other words, when it comes to understanding Revelation 20, what sort of questions are necessary to ask so that we can open the right doors into this incredible passage? Well, one question is, we need to ask, what is the relationship between Revelation 19 and Revelation 20? What is the relationship between Revelation 19 and Revelation 20? If you see it as a chronological relationship, in other words, Revelation 20 follows chronologically from the events that happen in Revelation 19, then you're probably going to be premillennial, okay? Because in Revelation 19, Jesus shows up. He shows up before the millennial, so it's a premillennial showing up, right? However, if you see it more as a recapitulation, a retelling of these stories, then arguably you might end up being all millennial. For those who are watching the podcast via video, you'll see on the screen that I've highlighted in green these words, "Then I saw." So Revelation 20 begins, "Then I saw an angel coming down from heaven." You'll notice that that phrase, "Then I saw," occurs in Revelation 19 as well. Revelation 19, verse 17, "Then I saw an angel standing in the sun." Revelation 19, verse 11, "Then I saw heaven opened." And you get these refrains, these repetitions of this phrase, "Then I saw," because John is reporting to you that he is seeing yet another vision. Then I saw, then I saw, then I saw. In Revelation 20, verse 4, "Then I saw thrones," and so forth and so on. And I think this is a very interesting juncture that we need to stop and take a breather and say, okay, what do we do with this? Is John reporting something chronologically? In other words, is he saying, "Then I saw" next in the order of sequential events? Or is he saying, "Then I saw a vision that is you're going to recapitulate all the other stuff that came before"? Well, these are the questions that we need to ask, and they push us to answer them. We have to make some interpretive moves. We have to make some interpretive decisions. So it's, anyway, as you begin to dive into this text, again, it's all about finding the right questions to ask. And you might think, well, I don't know where to begin. How do I start finding the right questions to ask? You begin by noticing things in the text that repeat. When the text repeats itself, "Then I saw, then I saw, then I saw, then I saw," then that should bring up on your radar that this is something important, right? And then you might ask, well, why is it important? And see, that's the question to ask. That's the first question to ask. Okay, there are other things as well. So I'm also interested in the way in which Revelation 20 mirrors Revelation 12. I'll talk more about this in just a moment, but I just want to toss it out there. I notice in Revelation 20 very similar phrases, words, concepts, and events that sure sound like Revelation 12. I say this is important because, as many commentators will point out, Revelation 12 is the center of the book. And so when I see something repeating the central message of the book, then I've got, again, on my radar, something pinging. I got to say, okay, what is going on with this repetition? All right. All right. So we move on. How are we to interpret the binding of Satan? So Satan is bound in Revelation 20. It says he is bound, thrown in prison. An angel does this and throws him away for 1,000 years. So what does it mean for a devious angel or a devious spiritual being such as Satan? What does it mean for him to be bound? And is there precedent in the Bible for the binding of something, especially sinister spiritual beings? The answer to that question is yes, there is. Now, another question to ask is, okay, what about in Jewish literature, in non-canonical Jewish literature? Are there other texts that we could point to help us to think through what it means to bind Satan? And the answer to that question is yes. And so we'll be looking at some of that later. Anyway, so yeah, let's move on. Speaking of 1,000 years, he's bound for 1,000 years. So what do we do with 1,000? That number is really intriguing. Should we interpret it literally? Should we interpret it symbolically? Again, that's the right question to ask. And it's a question that divides many Christians, many good Christians on both sides of that question, but it is one that we need to address. And I will address what I think about that in this section, in this episode today. Another important question that commentators ask is, why does Satan get released? So if you read in Revelation 20, you'll notice that he's not only bound for 1,000 years, but after the 1,000 years has ended, he is released and he goes off and does some bad stuff. Now, the question would be, why is he released? What's the point of him being released? We're going to be looking at that question as well. The final question I think that is important in asking, a final question I think is helpful to ask so that we can understand what's going on in this text, is this next question. When Satan is released after the 1,000 years, it says he goes off and he's going to go off to deceive and build an army to wage war against God and God's people. The question is, who is he out to deceive? Because under the premillennial view, that might be problematic because Jesus has set up a literal 1,000-year reign on the earth. And so it goes on for 1,000 years. It's bliss. It's total peace. It's great. So Satan is released after that. And then who is he out to deceive at that point? Now, this is not a slam dunk against premillennialism. There are answers to that question, but it is nonetheless a question worth asking. And it's a data point that we do need to consider. All right, so let's just jump back into these parallels that I mentioned a moment ago, namely the similarities that we see between Revelation 20 and verse 12. Honestly, I'm not going to do a whole lot with this. I just want to toss it out there for now and just illustrate the ways in which these two passages mirror one another. Okay, so in Revelation 20, I'm going to go ahead and read verses 1 through 3. And if you're following along on the video, I've got this pulled up on the screen in two panels so that you can compare Revelation 20 and 12. I've got it highlighted in pretty colors, and so you'll be able to spot the similarities here in these texts. All right, so Revelation 20, verses 1 through 3 says this, and I'm reading from the English Standard Version. It says, "Then I saw an angel coming down from heaven, holding in his hand the key to the bottomless pit and a great chain. And he seized the dragon, that ancient serpent who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years and threw him into the pit and shut it and sealed it over time so that he might not deceive the nations any longer until the 1,000 years were ended. And after that, he must be released for a little while." Okay, so that's the text that we're going to be dealing with today. I want to draw some comparisons. When you look at Revelation chapter 12, starting at verse 7, you're going to see some similarities. It says, "Now war arose in heaven, Michael and his angels fighting against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back, but he was defeated, and there was no longer any place for them in heaven. And the great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent, who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him." Revelation 12, 7 through 9. Okay, so the first thing I want to notice here is the activity of an angel. In Revelation 20, it is not God who binds Satan, at least not directly. It is an angel who comes down from heaven. He's got a key in his hand to the bottomless pit, and he seizes the dragon and he throws him there. It's an angel who does that. I can't help but remind myself of a quote from C.S. Lewis, and it's a helpful quote. It says that God's opposite is not Satan. The opposite of Satan is Michael the archangel, not God. It's not, sometimes we think of God versus Satan as if they're two equals. I mean, sometimes that's how the language gets thrown out, but that's not the truth. God is the Almighty. There's none like him. Anybody who rebels against him is rebelling as his inferiors, right? And so here we see that that an angel, a good angel, is quite capable of seizing the dragon. Satan is a pitiful, rebellious creature, and he when it comes to fighting against the armies of heaven, he stands no chance. So anyway, I just want to toss that out there because I think it is helpful to notice that an angel is the one who's binding, who is imprisoning the devil. Now, in Revelation 12, it was also an angel who cast Satan down. It was an angel who did the warfare, right? So here it is Michael, the archangel. Michael, of course, being the protector angel of God's people. And here he is the one doing the fighting. Now, of course, we talked about in our episode in Revelation 12 that the reason Satan is cast down has to do with the ascension of Jesus, right? So I don't want to negate that. That's the most important thing that we need to highlight. But when it comes to the direct activity of these angels, we see it highlighted here, a war between them, and Michael, of course, being the victor, and he casts Satan down. All right, so you notice that it's the activity of angels on both sides in Revelation 20 and in Revelation 12. What's also interesting is the way Satan is described. In Revelation 20, he's called that dragon, the ancient serpent, who is the devil and Satan. In Revelation 12, it's the same thing. He says the great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent, who is called the devil and Satan. Very similar language, and of course, commentators are going to pick up on that, and they're going to highlight that, just as I've highlighted it here. And I think it's a data point that we need to keep in mind, that things are mirroring each other. Another interesting thing here, and I don't want to make too much of this, but I do think it's worth talking about, is how in Revelation 20, Satan is thrown into the pit. He is thrown into the pit. Now here it's the abyss. That's how you would translate it, into the abyss. Actually, the abyss would be a transliteration. But anyway, that's beside the point. But it's the word here, it's the preposition ace in Greek, and it's into the pit. Now, whenever you look and compare this to Revelation 12, it says Satan was thrown down to the earth. That's how the English Standard Version translates. It says thrown down to the earth. It's interesting because the preposition there is still ace. He's thrown into the earth. I don't know. I don't want to make much of this, but there is enough similarity here because in both cases, Satan is being thrown down, and it seems he's being thrown ace into something, into another realm, you might say, right? Okay, so yeah, I think that's something to highlight. Now, in both of these texts, in Revelation 20 and Revelation 12, Satan is hindered from doing something. In Revelation 20, he is cast into the pit so that he doesn't deceive the nations any longer. Okay, that's the purpose of imprisoning the devil. Now, in Revelation 12, he's also hindered. Now, you might ask, well, what is he hindered from doing after being cast out of heaven? Well, I think the assumption here is that he can no longer accuse God's people. He no longer has a place in the heavenly realm before God to accuse God's people. Why not? Well, because Jesus has paid the price. He's ransomed the people and he's rescued the people. And because he has taken his throne, there is literally no more room for an accuser, such as the devil, such as the accuser, right? So he's cast down. So by being cast down, he has been hindered from accusing people. So I find it interesting that both of these texts actually show that his being cast down hinders him from doing something. Again, just a data point. I think it is worth mentioning. Okay, the last point that I want to mention here, it might take just a bit to explain it, but when you look at Revelation 20, specifically down further into the text, which we won't get into these verses until later, but if you, that is, we won't get into them until later in the next episode, but if you read down in Revelation 20, verses 7 and following, it talks about how that when the devil is released, he goes off and he starts gathering the nations for a battle. It's a great big battle, right? So that's after his release. So you see that same sort of structure in Revelation 12 through 19. Okay. So in Revelation 12, of course, Satan is cast down to the earth, and he's furious because he's cast to the earth, and he tries to, he's tried to devour the child that was born, but he's hindered from doing that. And so he summons two monsters, one from the ocean, one from the sea, one from the land, and they go off and do really bad things. They become this sort of socio-political entity that the devil uses, in a sense, to persecute the world. And of course, we have already seen later in Revelation 19 how the beast gather the nations for war against the rider on the white horse. So, for example, it says in Revelation 19, it says, "And I saw the beast and the kings of the earth with their armies gathered to make war against him who was sitting on the horse and against his army." Okay, so my point is to say, Revelation 12 kicks off a series of events that in which we see Satan fall from heaven, and we see him gather two monsters who gather the armies who eventually in chapter 19 begin to wage war against the Messiah. Okay. So, in other words, Revelation 12 through 19 tells a story that seems to be repeated in Revelation 20. Here we have Satan doing that very thing, gathering the nations for this final battle. All right. So, the reason I'm comparing Revelation 12 with Revelation 20 is because I want to tease out the idea, or at least entertain the possibility, that Revelation 20 is recapitulating some of the stuff that went before. Now, this is not a slam dunk in that favor, right? And maybe an all-millennialist would say, absolutely, yeah, this is exactly what we believe, that Revelation 20 recapitulates stuff, right? Well, before we jump into that, we can acknowledge that it's not a slam dunk. But there seems to be data that might support that position. So maybe Revelation 20 is recapitulating some of the themes that we see in Revelation 12 through 19 in some sort of condensed form. So Revelation 20 is like a condensed form of some of that other stuff, right? But maybe not, right? A premillennialist could come along and say, well, no, not at all. That's not how we should read it. What we should see is how Satan is kind of taking steps in his fall. He's in heaven, then he's kicked to the earth, and then from the earth, he's kicked into a pit. And so, yeah, a premillennialist could say that there is repetition, but it's not anti-chronological repetition. Maybe as time goes on, Satan continues to fall one step further down into the abyss, into something in which he later finds himself in the lake of fire, like the ultimate dead end, right? And so maybe, I think as one commentator said, maybe history is just repeating itself, but maybe it's repeating itself chronologically. You see what I mean? So I hate to put a fire on our all-millennialist viewpoint here, but I do think that's a reasonable position. In other words, the recapitulation idea makes sense, but it's not the only game in town. The non-recapitulation view, in other words, the chronological view, has something going for it as well. Again, it all depends on what you do with some of these texts. It depends on what you do with the relationship between Revelation 19 and Revelation 20. Hey everyone, I want to interrupt for just a moment to say thank you to all our supporters on Patreon. As a listener-supported podcast, a Patreon membership helps to keep everything up and running. Thank you so much for your partnership. If you're interested in learning how you can support the show, visit our Patreon page. Every supporter gets access to a ton of bonus content, from blogs, videos, book giveaways, to monthly meetings. It's all there, so check it out. Visit patreon.com/thebibleunmuted or click the link in the description for this episode. Thank you for your prayers each and every week and your support each and every month. It helps me do what I do. All right, friends, let's get back to today's discussion. All right, so let's just keep moving. Okay, I'm thinking of the questions. I'm not really good at giving answers. I think I'm decent asking the right questions. And so here we are, asking the questions. Let's keep going. What's up with binding? What's going on with binding? All right. Well, I'm glad you asked that question. The binding, as I said, is meant to keep Satan from deceiving the nations. All right. So let me go to Revelation 20. It says in let's just say verse 2, it says, he sees the angel sees the dragon, that ancient serpent who is the devil and Satan, bound him for 1,000 years. That word bound is deo, and it to bind something, to wrap it up. to bind it for 1,000 years, and threw him into the pit and shut it and sealed it over him so that he might not deceive the nations any longer until the 1,000 years had ended or were ended. After that, he must be released for a little while. So I mentioned earlier that there was precedent for the idea of binding spiritual entities, both in canonical literature and in pseudepigraphical texts. All right. So to illustrate this point, let me go to the book of Tobit. Tobit for Protestants is apocryphal. For Catholics and others, it's going to be deuterocanonical. In other words, it's going to be definitely part of the Bible. So this would be a text, depending on your tradition, is either non-canonical or canonical. But anyway, it is still a very important text. And by the way, if you're a Protestant, you need to read these texts. They're very, very important. So that you can build a conceptual framework for how to think about some of the New Testament stuff. It's super helpful, at least. I teach a class on this at Eternity College every year, and it's one of my favorite classes. It's called Jewish and Greco-Roman Backgrounds of the New Testament, and this is the sort of stuff we read. We read the book of Tobit. It's a lot of fun. Maybe on the podcast we can go through Tobit or something. But anyway, in Tobit chapter 8, verses 1 through 3, we see that an angel, or a demon rather, is bound by the angel Raphael. Okay? It says, when they had finished eating and drinking, they wanted to retire, so they took the young man and brought him into the bedroom. Then Tobias remembered the words of Raphael. That's one of the powerful angels. And he took the fish's liver and heart out of the bag where he had them and put them on the embers of the incense. The odor of the fish so repelled the demon that he fled to the remotest parts of Egypt. But Raphael followed him and at once bound him there hand and foot. Okay, you're probably thinking, what in the world is this context? Well, I'm not going to tell you. You just need to go read Tobit. But my point in bringing this up is to say that there is precedent in the literature, in the Jewish literature, of one angel bounding or binding another angel in the earth. Isn't that interesting? All right, so John's not making stuff up. He's operating in this conceptual framework or in this worldview. We also see the same thing in First Enoch. All right, so Protestants and Catholics and Orthodox are going to be agreed that Enoch is not a canonical literature. Of course, if you're part of the Ethiopian church, you would think that this is canonical. So for some Christians, it is, but nonetheless, I would say most of us, it's not. But it's still a very important text, First Enoch. In First Enoch, of course, you have this a sort of commentary, this telling of the Genesis 6 story in more depth. So Genesis 6, 1 through 4 records how these sons of God, these spiritual entities, they come down, they procreate with women, and they end up producing hybrids or the Jewish understanding of this, and I have to say this all across the board, the Jewish understanding of this text is exactly how I explain it. It's a literal, it's not like the modern Sethite view that doesn't seem to be the case in the ancient world. They legit believe that, and there was a strong consensus that these were spiritual creatures coming down to the earth, and they were procreating with women and creating these sort of these giants, if you will, right? And this is stuff that today we might look at and say, oh, that's just really weird. I don't know if I can believe that. But it's very clear in the first century that the early Christians believed this as well. That does shift a little bit with Augustine. Augustine sort of takes us into left field, and he gives a different opinion about that. But earlier, before him, this was the consensus view. As far as I know, at least, this was the consensus view. At any rate, Enoch is going to tell us more about all of that event. And he's going to depict it in a way that shows how Jewish people viewed that event. This was not a good thing, in other words, that these spiritual beings rebelled against God in this way and procreated with women. And so they were going to be judged. And Enoch was going to be the one to announce the judgment that would come upon them. And so anyway, part of this involves the good angels such as Michael, who we see in Revelation 12. Michael is going to have a role in bringing judgment upon these rebellious spiritual creatures that procreated with women. And so God tells Michael, and I'm going to read this passage here. God says to Michael in 1 Enoch chapter 10, verse 11, it says, and to Michael God said, make known to Semyaza. Semyaza was one of the spiritual beings that rebelled. Make known to Semyaza and the others who are with him, who fornicated with women, that they will die together with them in all their defilement. And when they and all their children have battled with each other, and when they have seen the destruction of their beloved ones, bind them for 70 generations underneath the rocks of the ground until the day of their judgment and of their consummation, until the eternal judgment is concluded. In those days, they will lead them into the bottom of the fire and in torment. in the prison where they will be locked up forever. And at that time, they will burn and die. Those who collaborated with them will be bound together with them, and bound together with them from henceforth into the end of all generations. If you're looking on the screen, I've underlined in blue the word bind and bound. And in some Greek extant manuscripts, the word there is deo. It's the same word that's used in Revelation 20. So, all to say, there is precedent for the binding of sinister spiritual beings in both canonical and non-canonical literature. We'll actually look at some stuff in the Gospel of Mark in just a little bit. But anyway, this is where we're seeing this. So yeah, what do we say about this? Well, in these texts, we see that this binding is temporary, and it's to sort of keep them in a holding pattern until the final judgment comes. Now, that works for a premillennial and amillennial view with respect to the binding of Satan in Revelation 20. It's sort of a holding thing that Satan is hindered for a time. So an amillennialist would say he's hindered for all of the church age until he's put into the lake of fire. And the premillennialists would say, no, he's not hindered now, but he will be, and that's a holding pattern for him to wait until he goes into the lake of fire. So it's very consistent with the structure that we see in the book of Tobit. Okay. I'm sorry, in the book of First Enoch. Tobit's a little different, but it's still part of that same conceptual universe. So what's up with binding? That's what's up with binding. All right, so then we're going to move to a next question. How should we understand the 1,000 years? Is this a literal 1,000 years? Well, as many commentators point out, is like, well, it doesn't have to be. Okay, so for example, the famous verse that everybody points to is Psalm chapter 50, verse 10. It says, "For every beast of the forest is mine, the cattle on 1,000 hills." This is God speaking, and he's saying, I own everything. It's not to suggest that he doesn't own the cattle on the 1,001st hill or the 1,002nd hill. No. It's not literal. 1,000 here just means everything or a whole bunch, right? And so here's a way of illustrating how 1,000 doesn't have to be literal. We have to remember in Revelation that numbers hold high symbolic value. 144,000, right? So there you have a multiple of 12 and a multiple of 1,000. And so those two multiples come together to do some really cool things with respect to how to understand the fullness of God's people. We've talked about that before, but that's an illustration of how a number can hold symbolic weight, right? The number 7, the number 666. I mean, numbers are used throughout Revelation in highly symbolic ways. We've already talked about 666. This was a symbol for a name, all right? And so we have to come back to Revelation 20 without forgetting all that stuff about numbers. In Revelation 20, why should we suppose that 1,000 ought to mean a literal 1,000? We don't have to suppose that at all. Now, all millennialists would, of course, at this point say, absolutely, Matt, that's what we've been saying. You don't have to suppose it's a literal 1,000 years. It could be, 2,000 years or 3,000 years. It's not literal, it's symbolic. A premillennialist, most of them at least the ones I've hung around in the past, they're going to typically insist on something along the lines of a literal 1,000 years. Part of that has to do with the way they read Revelation as a whole. They like to read it chronologically, which has a sense of literalness to it, you might say. By the way, I hate that word literal. What does literal literally mean? I don't know. But anyway, they read Revelation just in chronological ways. And so that sort of has a feel to it that it's not as I guess creative as a recapitulating view. And so because that feels more literal, they're going to interpret other things more literally too. But I have to caveat this is not a slam dunk against premillennialists, because if you're a premillennialist, you don't have to believe that it's a literal 1,000 years. You can say, okay, I get it. 1,000 may be symbolic, but it's still going to be a premillennial 1,000-year understanding. In other words, Jesus will come back and set up a symbolic 1,000 years, and then he's going to let the devil go for a while, and then he's going to put him away for eternity. That works just fine in a premillennial understanding of things. So just throwing that out there. Again, you have to make a lot of interpretive decisions, and there's a lot of good arguments on both sides. Okay, the other question that we asked initially was, why must the devil be released? I think it's such a great question. I think I would answer that question by saying, well, why must any of the wicked angels be released? And you might be thinking, well, what other angels? Well, we have to go back to Revelation 9 to see what I mean. When you go back to Revelation chapter 9 and you look at the fifth and the sixth trumpets, you'll see that in those passages, these sinister beings are being released. So let's look at the sixth trumpet first. In Revelation 9, starting at 13, we'll see something really, really interesting. It says that then the sixth angel blew his trumpet, and I heard a voice from the four horns of the golden altar before God, saying to the sixth angel who had the trumpet, release the four angels who are bound at the great river Euphrates. That word bound is deo, it's the same word. So we've already seen sinister spiritual beings being bound previously all the way back to Revelation chapter 9. I think that's really interesting. It's very important data you got to keep in mind. So again, is this recapitulating a story, or is it just retelling the same story as the chronological story progresses? Well, that's the $1,000,000 question. It's the $1,000 question. That's a better way to put it. Release the four angels who are bound at the great river Euphrates. So the four angels were released who had been held ready for the hour, the day, the month, and the year to kill a third of mankind. The number of troops of cavalry was 200 million. I heard their number, and this was how I saw the horses in my vision. And it goes on and talks a little bit more specifically about these sorts of beings that come about. But nonetheless, it's a cavalry. It's a 200 million armed cavalry. And it's the last battle. That's exactly what you see in Revelation 20 with when another sinister being is being released. He goes off and builds an army. And again, it sounds so, I don't know, recapitulatory. That's just something that I think we need to keep in mind. But my point here is to say, or rather to answer the question, why are they being released? Well, they're being released is just part of the judgment cycle itself. This is part of the seven trumpets. It is one of the three major cycles of judgment, and we recall how we've looked at Revelation and we've said that judgment operates by allowing evil to implode on itself. So if the world insists on worshiping demons, then demons is exactly what the world will get. And once the demons are released and they go about like locusts and they eat up everything. The demons are destructive. They're not constructive. They destroy things, including the people that worship them. And if people refuse to repent and come back to God, then according to the Revelation narrative, they will reap what they have sown. They will be given the very thing that they want, and that will prove to be their own undoing. Again, we're seeing this whole idea of reciprocal judgment come back and back and back again, over and over and over again. One might say it's a theme that is recapitulated all the time through Revelation. So then when we go and we look at the beginning of Revelation 9, which is the fifth trumpet, we see something very similar. It says, and the fifth angel blew his trumpet, and I saw a star that had fallen from heaven to earth, and he was given the key to the shaft of the bottomless pit. Oh my goodness, think about this. This is what we read in Revelation 20. At least it seems to be. A star here is an angel. It's angel language. It comes down and has a key to a pit. That sounds like the good angel in Revelation 20 that has a key to a pit in which he locks Satan up for a while. All right, it's a data point. He opened the shaft of the bottomless pit, and from the shaft rose smoke like the smoke of a great furnace, and the sun and the air were darkened with the smoke from the shaft. Then from the smoke came locusts on the earth, and they were given authority like the authority of scorpions of the earth. They were told not to damage the grass of the earth or any green growth or any tree, but only those people who did not have the seal of God on their foreheads. They were allowed to torment them for 5 months, but not to kill them. And their torture was like the torture of a scorpion when it stings someone. So again, this is part of the judgment cycle. They are released because that's just how judgment is going to operate in the book of Revelation. Judgment is all about giving people what they want. They want demons. They want to worship demons. They're going to get demons, and we're going to have to unlock the pit in which they are imprisoned and let them out. Okay. So, what do we do with all of this? What do we do? How do we put these pieces, these puzzles together? Well, I think what we can say about the release of these bound devils, if you will, is that it's a way of limiting their destruction. So they're bound, though they are released, but even in their release, they are still limited. So, for example, we just read in Revelation chapter 9, verse 5, it says they were allowed to torment them for 5 months, and it was given to them. They were allowed to do this for only 5 months. Why 5 months? Well, such an odd number, quite literally an odd number. And I think it's just meant to say that they don't get away with much, right? There are things that they're going to do, but God's still going to hold them back some, and they're not allowed to kill people, so there are constant restraints. So this is another theme in Revelation, is that these sinister spiritual beings are not given full reign; they're given limited reign for a purpose, right? And as we saw previously, these judgment cycles are meant to elicit repentance in people. Of course, that's sad because sometimes people don't want to repent, and that's just part of it. But all to say, binding here seems to limit them. There's always a limit on these creatures, right? The ultimate limit, it seems, is binding them up for some reason. Okay, so kind of backing up, going back to Revelation 20, it says, I think. Well, let me just pause for a moment and jump into something here. I think a case could be made that what we're seeing in Revelation 20 about Satan's being bound, I'm just going to go ahead and say it. What we see in Revelation 20 about Satan's being bound, a case could be made that it's just another way to describe how he is limited, just like these other descriptions in Revelation describe this as well. It's just, but only the difference being in Revelation 20, we're not talking about multiple different angels being bound. We're talking about the ringleader of the angels. It's sort of funneling in its focus on the ringleader in Revelation 20. Previous to that, we are focused on all sorts of demons and locust demons and two monsters, one from the sea, one from the ocean, and so forth. But here in Revelation 20, we are focusing on the ringleader. Okay, so a case could be made that this is a recapitulation story. It's a story that's told for the 10th time, right? But this time it's told from the perspective of what's going on with the ringleader, with Satan. Okay, I think that's one reasonable way to talk about it. But the other difference in Revelation 20 is that the text there is telling us how and in what way he is limited. Okay, so he's limited in Revelation 20 in his being bound by the fact that he cannot deceive the nations. And perhaps, arguably, it could be the case that this is a way to describe the church age. Okay, we are told, for example, in the gospel stories that hell cannot stand against the advancement of the church. We are told in the gospel stories that Satan is defeated by the gospel, right? I mean, this is the whole idea of Jesus' ministry, his life, death, crucifixion, and his going into Hades, and his coming up victoriously in resurrection and his ascension. Okay, and in Revelation 20 is I think really important in that respect, because it could be telling that story in, albeit a very focused sort of way, in a way that hasn't quite been told previously in Revelation. It could, in other words, be a total recapitulation of what's going on. Now, so an amillennialist is, if you're an amillennialist, you're like clapping your hands and you're saying, yeah, we got Matt on our team. But let me throw a caveat here. Clearly, though, one could also reasonably make the case that prior to Revelation 20, the devil is he is doing exactly that. He is deceiving the nations. I mean, he's doing it through the beasts, right? But nonetheless, indirectly or directly, whatever the case, he is deceiving the nations in Revelation. Prior to everything, Revelation 20, right? That's exactly what he's doing. He is the deceiver. But something shifts in Revelation 20 where he's no longer capable of doing that. And so all of a sudden, the premillennialists are applauding what I've just said, and they're agreeing with everything that I'm saying here. Well, although let me caveat even this. Elsewhere, Jesus does seem to say in the Gospels that Satan has already been judged during Jesus's lifetime 2,000 years ago at the start of the church age. So when we look at the Gospel of John, for example, this is exactly what we see. Jesus answered. He says, now is, let's see, John 12:31. It says, now is the judgment of this world. Now will the ruler of this world be cast out. And when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all people to myself. In other words, the idea is that in Jesus's ministry, I think specifically as we see with his death, burial, resurrection, and ascension, that's the moment where Satan is cast out of heaven. Revelation 12. We've seen this, right? Revelation 12 stuff. And then at that point, he can draw all people to himself. Why? Because the devil can't deceive the nations anymore. That the gospel will advance, and the gospel is itself almost the way that Satan is bound, right? It's interesting. In St. Augustine, in his book, The City of God, book 20, chapter 7, as I recall, he talks about what is it, he asked the question, what does it mean for Satan to be bound in the abyss? He says, well, it means that Satan is bound in the abyss of the wicked heart. That's what he says. He gives this highly symbolic sort of way of understanding the imprisonment or the binding of Satan. And to be honest with you, I don't think he's far off. I think that's a very creative way of seeing it, of course. And there's a part of me is like, okay, you're stretching things just a little bit, but then part of me is like, no, actually, he's not. Revelation is a highly symbolic book full of all sorts of different signs and symbols, as we've seen. And so, for Augustine, the binding of Satan is itself a symbol that Satan has been bound in the heart of the obstinate, of the wicked, those who say no to Jesus and whatnot. We see in Mark that word deo come up quite prominently, in my opinion. Jesus says, Jesus is accused of casting out demons through the prince of demons and so forth. And Jesus says, Mark chapter 3, verse 23 says, how can Satan cast out Satan? If a kingdom is divided against itself, that kingdom cannot stand. And if a house is divided against itself, that house will not be able to stand. And if Satan has risen up against himself and is divided, he cannot stand, but is coming to an end. But no one can enter a strong man's house and plunder his goods unless he first binds the strong man. That's the word deo. Binds the strong man. Then indeed he may plunder the house. Here Jesus does seem to be referring to Satan, and he does seem to be referring to Satan's being bound, and he is telling us who is doing the binding. It's the work and the ministry of the Messiah himself. All right, I've won back all my all-millennial audience, and I'm hearing your applause loud and clear. Because it does seem that Jesus is saying Satan that has been cast out and has been bound as a result of his ministry. We could even proceed to the Great Commission. We know this story quite well at the end of the book. Go therefore and make disciples. Oh, let me back up. It says, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and Son and the Holy Spirit. All right, so Jesus is saying all authority has been given to me. There's not one microscopic tidbit that hasn't been given to me. And I'm telling you, go out and get the nations, all the nations, right? Now, I've underlined on the screen here, all the nations. Why did I do that? Because that's the point of Revelation 20 in the binding of Satan, so that he will not deceive the nations. And I think this is a very powerful argument that I think all millennialists have in their arsenal to show that that view makes the best sense of the whole sweep of Scripture and the gospel and the Gospels as we have them in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. There are other texts, I think, in Paul's writings that we could pull from that would reinforce this all millennial interpretation and so on. So I think it's a powerful argument. Not gonna lie, guys. I think the all millennial position has something going for it. That said, as I mentioned, I'm going to close up with this, but as I mentioned earlier, the premillennial position was, it seems, the fairly dominant view early on. And in fact, the Jewish literature seems to attest to this, right? So if you read commentaries on this, they're often going to point out how in the Jewish literature, this idea of an intermediate kingdom, a messianic intermediate kingdom, was sort of the big game that was being played back in the day. In other words, it was the story being told. This was the hope that people had about the Messiah. He would show up, have an intermediate kingdom. There'd be like a final war, and then all things would be well after that. And that's essentially the premillennial position. There's several texts that we could point to. One that I do want to point to is a text called 4th Ezra. Now, well, what do I say about 4th Ezra? It was written. First of all, it's a composite text, meaning that it comes to us after the result of editors. The core part of it is called the Apocalypse of Ezra. This is chapters 3 through 14. I think that's right. Yeah, 3 through 14. And it was a Jewish writing written sometime around AD 100. So it's a contemporary to the Revelation text that we've been studying. And therefore, it makes for a really important text from which we can pull data and compare to Revelation. So anyway, yeah, but the first two chapters and the last two chapters of Fourth Ezra were probably added a couple hundred years after it was written by a Christian editor. Anyway, we don't have to get into all of that, but suffice it to say, in the apocalypse of Ezra, the central part in chapter 7, we see an intermediate kingdom idea that would be, it seems, consistent with a premillennial view of things, right? And again, this is AD 100 when this is written, so it's a contemporary to Revelation. Let me read this. It's 4th Ezra, chapter 7, verses 26. Let's just read the whole thing. We've got time. 26 through 44. For behold, the time will come when the signs which I have foretold to you will come to pass. The city which now is not seen shall appear, and the land which now is hidden shall be disclosed. And everyone who has been delivered from the evils that I have foretold shall see my wonders. For my son, the Messiah, shall be revealed with those who are with him, and those who remain shall rejoice 400 years. This is a 400-year kingdom, which is interesting. It's not 1,000 here in this text, at least, but it's still an intermediate kingdom, as you'll see. 400 years, and after these years my son the Messiah shall die, and all who draw human breath. And the world shall be turned back to primeval silence for 7 days, as it was at the first beginning, so that no one shall be left. And after the 7 days, the world which is not yet awake shall be roused, and that which is corruptible shall perish. And the earth shall give up those who are asleep in it, and the chambers shall give up the souls which have been committed to them. And the Most High shall be revealed upon the seat of judgment, and compassion shall pass away, and patience will be withdrawn, but judgment alone shall remain. Truth shall stand, and faithfulness shall grow strong, and recompense shall follow, and the reward shall be manifested. Righteous deeds shall awake, and unrighteous deeds shall not sleep. Then the pit of torment shall appear, and opposite it shall be the place of rest, and the furnace of hell shall be disclosed, and opposite the paradise of delight. Then the Most High will say to the nations that have been raised from the dead, look now and understand whom you have denied, whom you have not served, whose commandments you have despised. Look on this side and on that. Here are delight and rest, and there are fire and torments. Thus he will speak to them on the day of judgment, a day that has no sun or moon or stars or cloud or thunder or lightning or wind or water or air or darkness or evening or morning or summer or spring or heat or winter or frost or cold or hail or rain or dew or noon or night or dawn or shining or brightness or light, but only the splendor of the Lord, splendor of the glory of the Most High, by which all shall see what has been determined for them. For it will last for about a week of years. This is my judgment and its prescribed order, and to you alone have I shown these things. It's really that first part that we talked about, or that I just read here in verse 28. It says, for my son the Messiah shall be revealed with those who are with him, and those who remain shall rejoice 400 years. And after these years, my son the Messiah shall die, and all who draw human breath, and the world shall be turned back to primeval silence, and so forth. So, and of course, after that, you have final judgment, fire, torment, all that stuff, right? My point is to say that this is a text that seems to illustrate an intermediate messianic kingdom before the final things, right? That would be consistent with the premillennial view. So I've lost all of my all-millennial friends because what I've done is just highlighted the fact that the premillennial position or the premillennial structure for understanding the end times is a very old understanding, and one has to wonder, maybe John is thinking along these lines, right? Yeah, maybe so. I mean, again, a premillennial reading of Revelation 19 and Revelation 20 makes sense. You can make a strong case for that, and perhaps that's what clearly other Jews were thinking somewhat along those lines. Was John thinking along those lines? Premillennialists are going to say, yep, absolutely. But maybe not. Right? So hold on, all millennial friends. I've got one more line of defense that perhaps would make you cheery. Suppose it is the case that this was the predominant position, but maybe John doesn't believe it. Maybe this is not what John is talking about. But maybe he wants to incorporate the basic idea of that structure into another way of seeing things. Okay, what do I mean by that? Well, we have to understand the resurrection of Jesus. It all goes back to the resurrection of Jesus. Early Jews believed that at the end of the world, at the end of time, resurrection would happen. And by that, I mean everybody would be resurrected at the same time at the end of history. But what we see with Jesus is that he was resurrected in the middle of history. This is a point that N.T. Wright has rightly made in many of his books, that this would have been shocking to the disciples. Wait, we have resurrection in the middle of history? What does that possibly mean? Now, Jesus is the only one who resurrects, it seems, right on Easter Day. And in our resurrection, it seems, is postponed for a later time. All right. So you sort of have these two resurrection ideas. You have one in the middle of history, one at the end of history. Right. Now, it is also true that in the meantime, as we await our resurrection, we can still participate in the life of resurrection, in the resurrection of Jesus. So if you read Romans chapter 6, that's exactly what Paul is talking about. That if we are buried with him in our baptism, we are raised with him in new life. It's this idea of union with Christ. You see this in other texts as well. But this idea comes prominently in Romans chapter 6, that we are somehow mysteriously and mystically united to Christ by our faith, right? By our baptism, we are united with Christ, so that we're buried and risen. And so our conversion to Jesus is a sort of resurrection, right? And so perhaps it is the case that what John is doing is he is saying that the 1,000-year reign of Christ has commenced. It has begun, right? The Messiah has shown up after all, and therefore his reign has begun, but not in ways that we originally thought. There's some structural change to it, because there is a first coming, and then there is the parousia, the second coming, and when he consummates what he has inaugurated 2,000 years ago. So perhaps what John is doing is taking this idea of an intermediate kingdom at the end of the age, which was prominent among Jewish thinkers, it seems. And what he's done is he's brought it forward into the middle of time in the age of the church. And what he would say is, he would not say that he didn't believe in an intermediate messianic kingdom. No, he would say that this is the intermediate messianic kingdom. Like today, in the age of the church, this is the intermediate messianic kingdom. And at the end of that, Jesus will show up, and there'll be a war, and then ultimately recreation and final judgment. I guess what I'm saying and what I'm proposing to you is that perhaps in some way both could be correct. That whereas today the all-millennialists would say there's no future intermediate kingdom, right? And the premillennialists would say, yes, there is. Maybe John is saying there is an intermediate kingdom, and it's right now in the life of the church. We are ruling and reigning with Christ, especially those who have been martyred, especially those who've already gone on and gone to heaven to be with Jesus. So maybe all-millennialism is correct in that sense, right? Maybe we should look at this as the intermediate kingdom itself right now, right today. Again, I'm just really good at asking questions. At least, well, I have a lot more to learn on that, but that's what I like to focus on. I just want to ask the right questions, and maybe we'll discover the right answers. I don't know. What do you think? Does this make sense? Have I generated more questions than answers? Well, maybe so, and I apologize for that. But I want to get all the data on the table so that when we look at the data, we can put it all in the right piece. Or take all the pieces, I would say, and make the picture that we're intended to make. I hope this is helpful. I hope this has been encouraging to you, and I hope that it's helped you think through this very intriguing passage, Revelation 20, verses 1 through 3. When we come back next time, we're going to be diving straight into the rest of Revelation 20, and it's going to be a lot of fun. Well, friends, that's the end of today's episode. Thank you so much for listening. If you like this podcast, consider rating it on your podcast platform, and don't forget to subscribe and share with your friends as well. You can also support the podcast by becoming a Patreon member. Go to patreon.com/thebibleunmuted or click the link in the description for this episode. Thanks again for listening. Until next time, friends.